Welcome everybody to this, the final episode of the Book of Fables. We have come a very long way. We have learned many truths. We have learned about many fables. We have seen many stories and seen how fables and fairy tales often mirror that of a culture. And it's to mirrors that we turn in this, the final update of the Book of Fables. There's really only one character who's fitting for this last episode. A character who stands in our way, and yet is our mirror in a way in the game. That is the character of Bloody Mary, the sheriff, if you will, of the Crooked Man's forces. And she is an appropriate myth, fable, to close the Book of Fables series on because elements of her story are extremely modern and extremely ancient. She ties together the themes from a lot of the different eras that we've been looking at, both in terms of how she's spread, the myth is spread socially, where it comes from, and its influences. So, let's take a look at the legend of Bloody Mary. The legend of Bloody Mary itself is very simple in its original form that was started in the 1800s, although it happened as late as the 20th century. The procedure was to have a candle and walk past a mirror. You were supposed to walk up a flight of stairs backwards, holding a candle and a hand mirror in a darkened house. As you gaze into the mirror, supposedly this is what young ladies would do, you will be able to catch a view of their future husband's face. However, there was a small chance that you would see a visage of death, the Grim Reaper, indicating that you would die before you were married. And it's this sort of divination of the future, but also possible opening to the world of death that really makes Bloody Mary the myth that's used today. Now, the myth has gotten a little more violent over time. The procedure today is typically to look in a mirror and say either Bloody Mary 3 times or I believed in Bloody Mary 3 times. After that, the ghost Bloody Mary will appear and do any number of terrible things, sort of making you wonder why you would summon her in the first place. Stealing your soul, scratching your eyes out is a common one, giving you a curse of some kind, drinking your blood, anything like that. There is also the idea that you are supposed to, or you can, summon Bloody Mary by taunting her as regards her unborn child or her miscarried child or something like that. Okay, so let's unpack the legend of Bloody Mary and see where all this comes from. And let's begin at the very beginning with the idea of the mirror. Bloody Mary has always been associated with mirrors, and that is a truly ancient practice. The practice of divination using a mirror is called katoptromancy. I think I'm saying that right. Katoptromancy. Divination using a mirror, and it harkens back at least to ancient Greek times, when someone described a scene as follows. Before the temple of Ceres at Patras, there was a fountain separated from the temple by a wall, and there was an oracle, very truthful, not for all events, but for the sick only. The sick person let down a mirror suspended by a thread till its base touched the surface of the water, having first prayed to the goddess and offered incense. Then, looking in the mirror, he saw the presage of death or recovery, according as the face appeared fresh and healthy, or of a ghastly effect. This was in ancient Rome. There were particular priests using mirrors, and they were called the speculari, which is where speculate comes from. And so there was this idea, even from an ancient time, that mirrors could be a picture of the future, or they could have sort of this uncanny element. And if you remember, a lot of the ancient myths that we've been looking at are sort of a way to touch this other world, to have a brief encounter with the supernatural, and that was something that would change someone very profoundly. And you can imagine, in a world where mirrors weren't very common, how uncanny it had to be to see a clear image of yourself. you could see a blurred image of yourself in the waves or in, metal or something like that. But a mirror, a polished silvery mirror where you could see this very, very clear image of yourself, has this sort of uncanny feel about it. And even today, there is actually kind of a neat psychological experiment that I read about, and I think we'll do it right now if you're all right with that. I read about it on a psychiatrist's blog that I really enjoy, and it goes as follows. Imagine yourself in a room staring at a mirror, and you're staring at yourself completely expressionless. And just try to imagine that extremely clearly right now. You have no expression, you're not doing anything, your hands are at your sides, and you're staring at yourself in the mirror. Do you look like what you think you would have looked like? Do you look different in any way? Really try to imagine your face and your body and how they all look. Now, imagine that while you are completely motionless, the mirror slowly smiles. You're evil, right? I mean, your mirror double is. When you think about a mirror double slowly smiling and taking on its own agency in that way, that is considered to be one way that our brain has to visualize, to deal with the concept of these hidden feelings, these hidden feelings that can then be projected out onto the world of self-criticism or of evil within. And not necessarily evil, I suppose, but just the bad parts of ourselves that we subsume into the subconscious when directed onto someone who is exactly like us but not us, can have this very uncanny kind of evil sense to it. And so the idea of divination through mirrors, even back then, had this sense of danger to it, that it wasn't for everything, it was just for the sick. It was just for people who were touching the realms of the dead. And so that thread carries on throughout history. And in fact, we can see that there are a large number of spirits who were supposed to be contacted through mirrors or something like that. There was one in particular in Japan called the slit-mouthed girl who could be summoned either by walking around late at night or sometimes by looking into a mirror. And her deal was supposed to be her mouth was slit open from the sides of her neck on either side, and that was supposed to have happened sometimes because she was getting like plastic surgery or some kind of corrective surgery, or because she was very vain and spent a lot of time worrying about her appearance. And so her mouth would be completely open that way, and she wore a surgical mask to cover it. And if you meet her in the course of the night, as in Bloody Mary, there's some sort of questioning that you're supposed to answer. In Bloody Mary's case, it's supposed to be, your summoning is just, I believe in Bloody Mary, saying that you do believe in her, or making fun of her child or something like that. So it's a response. And with the slit-mouthed girl, she's supposed to ask, do you think I'm beautiful? If you reply, the legend goes, if you reply, yes I do, then she slits your mouth to look exactly the same as hers, thinking you'll like it. If you say no, she outright kills you with the giant pair of scissors she carries. I don't know where that comes from. The only way to avoid it is to give a neutral answer and to say, oh, you're okay, you're not great. And in her confusion, you can then escape. Anyway, so there are a number of spirits that are associated in this way. And naming them several times is something else that is said to summon spirits. But why Bloody Mary? What's in particular about her? Well, the first connection that people have made was to Mary the First of England, the first female to claim the supreme monarch rule of England. She was a staunch Catholic and executed a lot of Protestants, and so eventually she came to be known as Bloody Mary. And in fact was the impetus for the nursery rhyme, Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and pretty little maids all in a row. The idea there was a silver bell was supposed to be sort of a thumb screw, something that would tighten down on the fingers and torture you. Cockle shells was another sort of torture device which apparently would be attached to genitals in some way. Believe it or not, I didn't really want to look up the particulars of that. And Pretty Little Maids All in a Row could either be a reference to a row of guillotines, which would be used to execute people, or to, which I think is probably likely, to the graveyards filling with young people, maids, in rows, in neat ordered rows in graveyards. And so she was remembered as, it was a 5-year reign. She reestablished Roman Catholicism, obviously, after Henry VIII had removed England from that and became part of the Anglican Church. She reinstated Roman Catholicism and had over 280 religious dissenters either burned at the stake in what were called the Marian persecutions, or executed in other ways and tortured. So obviously not a super popular ruler. There's some discussion that she wasn't quite all that bad and that her rule was too short to really have any of her reforms take root, and also plagued by outside catastrophes, but nevertheless has this very bloody history associated with her, and so that name in particular, Bloody Mary, has carried on since then. And there's a second commonly thought origin for Bloody Mary, which is, and I think this is because this is when it came to America and became popular. It's thought to be someone who was executed in the Salem witch trials, but who was in fact a witch. So someone who would have had access to that scary, demonic otherworld, and who can now be summoned back. And that's where some of the idea of scratching eyes out or draining blood comes, because the idea is it's someone who's involved in torture and execution, in religious persecution, in one of the ways. It's also possible that making fun of Bloody Mary's baby, her dead or miscarried baby, could be another connection to Mary I, who's had a large number of miscarriages and false pregnancies during her life. And so the actual act of speaking Bloody Mary's name into the mirror and waiting to see someone appear actually has some neat psychological basis too. So this is a super modern thing, alright? So we've touched ancient, then we've touched the more modern political impetus for a lot of these fairy tales that we've talked about. And now let's talk super modern, where this is just sort of a fun psychological trick that's, you know, whatever, fun for girls to do at parties and stuff like that when they're having sleepovers. That it's a psychological trick, sometimes called the Caputo effect, which basically says, it talks about sensory deprivation. When the brain is deprived of any sensory input, it essentially starts to make up things on its own. You hear this when people put into complete sensory deprivation tanks. They start to hallucinate voices. Some people say they hear dead relatives and things like that. For whatever reason, when our brain starts hallucinating things and adding in its own effects, it tends to go dark and kind of creepy. And so, if you're in a darkened room and you're not getting much vision, and you're looking into a mirror, which is someplace you commonly would look to see faces and things like that, the facial recognition part of your brain, the software, you might say, glitches out, and you will see a face just very briefly appear in the mirror. And so using those little optical illusions, those brain tricks, that's the kind of thing that propagates today, where people like a good scare and can use these glitches in our brain to do that. And so, as I said in the beginning, Bloody Mary is a really, really interesting fable in that it very neatly ties together the ancient, middle, and modern uses of fairy tales. Whereas today, things are spread to scare us, and people enjoy being scared. The whole creepypasta phenomenon is kind of a modern fairy tale, and the idea of using psychological tricks and of having something which is setting the scene and allowing ourselves to be scared and to enter into this sort of spooky experience where we feel like we're touching another world. Well, that's got its ties in the ancient form of Bloody Mary too, which is of using the mirror to access that world. And then the actual form of the demon, the ghost, whatever that comes through, is found in the political satires, which were part of the point of fairy tales in the Middle Ages and later in the 1800s and things like that. And so it's just this really cool tying together of everything that we have faced. And that's what we come to at the end of the Book of Fables. And that's what we will come to at the end of The Wolf Among Us. We've still got to face up to Bloody Mary. We've got to face our reflection. We will engage in a little bit of mere divination ourselves. We will become a speculare and engage in cotropomancy, or however you say that. Hopefully we will like what we see. Hopefully we will see life and not death. But I guess you'll have to stick around. And so I will see you guys next time on The Wolf Among Us.